The recent terrorist attacks on the Paris offices of the satirical Charlie Hebdo Weekly have reignited a firestorm around the world over the need to stamp out terrorism. But back here in the United States, we've seen an incredible amount of terrorist activities carried out by political and religious extremists, yet there is little condemnation of these events. Joining me to talk about this is blogger and author Chauncey DeVega. So Chauncey, I guess what we're seeing, what we saw over in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and what we've seen in the United States here too many times to even, think about, is the fact that terrorism has almost become a form of politics. I mean, it seems like that is a way to get your point across without having to be an elected official or anyone in a seemingly position of power. Tell us a little bit, I know you've done some really great writing on this. Tell us, this terrorism politics concept here.
I mean, terrorism is basically violence for a political end that's designed to intimidate non-combatants in society at large. Now, terrorism can be targeted against military officials, state officials, but as we classically understand it in the modern era, terrorism is political violence against non-combatants. And one of the challenges with the horrible events in Paris is to also try to look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture being that we also have terrorism here in the United States. But when there's terrorism in the United States by white right-wing Christian terrorists, it's not called terrorism. It's called a lone wolf attack. And we just had the attack on the NAACP. We just had another hearing, actually, about an attack that was planned last year, and I think it was in Atlanta, actually in the Atlanta area in Georgia, where, again, white nationalist terrorists were planning an event equal to 9/11. So as much as we are concerned about politicized Islam, we need to have a very serious conversation in this country about right-wing domestic terrorists by white Christians.
Right, and it's almost impossible right now to turn on to CNN or Fox or any of the major, cable news outlets without hearing them talking about terrorism. But every time they say that word, it is in regards to Islamic fundamentalism. Now, in 2014, Cliven Bundy shows up on everybody's radar, ends up inadvertently recruiting an army. I mean, I don't know any other way to describe that. He influences and inspires this whole large group armed to the hilt with AK-47s lined up around his ranch saying, you are not going to come and take my cattle, even though I owe the government a couple $1 million. You're not going to do this. They're pointing guns at federal agents, threatening, come one step closer, we're going to blow your brains out. Now, in those discussions that we saw on traditional media, corporate media, about Cliven Bundy, especially not on Fox News, we did not hear him described as a domestic terrorist. Now, it might not have been Bundy himself. He was just he was a little crazy, didn't want to pay his grazing fees, but those that joined him, I really don't know of any other way to describe them other as terrorists, and yet we're so afraid to use that word.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Center has done some great research. More Americans have been killed by white right-wing Christian domestic terrorists since 9/11 than by Islamic terrorists in the United States. Again, another fact, because that's not an opinion, that's an empirical fact that you're not going to hear in the mainstream corporate media. Never mind, again, using Cliven Bundy as an example, he inspired the killers, again, terrorists, using politically motivated violence who killed the police in Las Vegas. We also have, again, examples of white right-wing terrorists attacking the Sikh temple, attacking synagogues, planning attacks all over the country under the banner of the sovereign citizen movement or under Christian Reconstructionism. So we have this perverse overlap where you have, again, politicized Islam by a small, very, very, very small group of people who use religion as a mask for their violence, but they have so much in common with right-wing Christian domestic terrorists in this country: a disregard for free speech, a dislike of secular government, a belief that government and religion and church should not be separate, an intolerance of women and homosexuals and our gay and lesbian and queer brothers and sisters. But again, you're not going to hear this in the mainstream media, because the minute you start talking about race and the minute you start engaging in critical thinking about terrorism, because terrorism is terrorism wherever it occurs, but it's much easier to bring up the Islamic brown boogeyman in 9/11 than to say, my God, we have white right-wing domestic terrorists right here in the United States that we need to, number one, publicly out, and we need to have Congress, the President, and the Senate actually sitting down, in addition to the House, of course, and actually having hearings on these matters. But as the listeners know, and as you know, Whenever you try to have that conversation about the relationship between white folks, Americans, terrorism, and guns, it is silenced immediately.
Well, one of the things, as you had pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, is that we like to classify it as a lone wolf attack. If somebody goes out there and shoots up a bunch of people, as Tom Hartman had said, we call that person a mass shooter or a mass murderer. And I think a lot of it has to do with almost the fragile psyche of the American public as a whole, in that when you talk terrorism, you're talking about an abstract. We don't know how many. We don't know where they are. We don't know where they're going to hit. We don't know where they came from. And that, as a nation, it terrifies us. But when you come out and you say it was a lone wolf attack and we got him, it's done. Okay, we got him. It's over. Oh, we can go about our lives. But that really ignores what is going on. I mean, when you have a right-wing Christian bomb an abortion clinic because of their religious beliefs, and they're trying to impose that belief and taking the lives of others, I don't see a difference between that and say a suicide bomber who straps on a bomb vest because of his religion. But we differentiate between those two in America. This is, a crazy guy bombed an abortion clinic, and over there, it's terrorism.
Yeah, and it's part of a broader discourse, and we've touched on this on Ring of Fire. I've written about it on ChaunceyDeVega.com, Alternate, and Salon, is that when it's a person of color, especially an African-American who commits a crime, we have to talk about black crime, and all African-Americans have to defend themselves because of an outlier. When a Muslim, again, acts as a terrorist, an outlier again, Islam is put on trial unfairly. But when white men who are Christians go and kill people, it's a lone wolf. We never engage in a serious conversation about masculinity, about whiteness, about white masculinity, and political violence. And we also see that with mass shooting events, where we've talked about this before. We have white men in this country are approximately 28% of the population. But they account for more than 3/4 of the mass shootings. Again, if you state that fact plainly, it's verboten. It's something that can't be discussed. And our political leadership, especially on the right, especially with the Tea Party GOP, who are beholden to the radical Christians and to the gun lobby, you're never going to be allowed to talk about that in mainstream public discourse because they will shut you down.
And it's very, unsettling to think about that because, 3/4 of the mass shooting, white guys. I mean, there's no other way to say it. And we don't ever have a discussion of what's with all this white violence. Why do we have so many white men who are clearly mentally unstable getting their hands on these weapons that can kill, 60 people in 20 seconds? We don't have those discussions. Now, if it were to be an African American that picked up a handgun that holds 6 bullets and he killed 6 people, then, okay, we have a serious problem with crime. Every African American needs to get out there and explain to us why we don't need to come and get you all, because aren't you all like this? I mean, it's infuriating, and I don't know. I'm almost at a loss for words because it really is such a difference between what we say about white America and it's not fair, and I don't get it. I really don't.
Yeah, I mean, as we started off, terrorism is a problem for all people of all colors, across the color line, of every religion, in every class, background. Likewise, crime is a problem for all people, across the color line, of every religious background, in every class background, and of both genders. But unfortunately, our public discourse is limited. Again, this is a great example of white privilege in action. You can have white folks walking around this country with machine guns, assault rifles, heavily armed, and the cops pat them on the shoulder or smile at them. Let a black person pick up a toy gun in a park or in a store, and they're shot dead. But again, it's a parallel to the conversation about terrorism, where when it's an ambiguous brown person who's Muslim, they're somehow a terrorist, and every Muslim needs to sit down and explain a minutia of their population. But a white Christian who bombs or plans to bomb the Martin Luther King Jr. site, the parade actually in Washington and Spokane, who bombed the NAACP building, who have planned other horrific events and have actually killed people all over this country. Again, the SPLC has great data, and we have dozens, if not hundreds, of murders linked to the website Stormfront, which is a white Christian nationalist website. But we don't have a serious conversation where white Christians are asked to hold their brothers and sisters accountable who are engaging in this type of hate.
Right. It is a glaring double standard that we have in the United States, and we don't look when a Christian goes out there again. I'm in Pensacola, Florida. We've had the abortion clinic bombings here. And so when a Christian goes out and does something like that, we don't sit them all down and say, there's a problem with your religion, you're too extreme, we're going to come send a drone and bomb you. Now, over in Muslim countries, we do that. We say every single member of your religion is now accountable for what a few people just did. Now, those acts are horrific. Don't get me wrong. What they did over in Paris, there is no excuse for that. There is no justification for it. But we don't have the same kind of reaction when it's a white guy who is so fundamental Christian that he can't even see straight, and he does it here. We hear on the news like there was a bombing by a guy. They don't even mention that he was white. They don't mention that he was Christian. And so what can we do? I mean, how do we even begin to address this problem?
I mean, it's a question of understanding our own country's history, both good and bad, a question about improving our educational system, which simply isn't going to happen when we have standardized testing and we have, again, the Tea Party taking over educational curricula all over this country, banning, again, any type of reasonable discussion about our country's history and the color line and power. And again, this is very, very timely, again, with what's going on with Paris, but also what's going on with the movie Selma. I just saw Selma. And I was thinking, my goodness, the KKK was the largest Christian organization, one of them in this country, and rather the largest Christian terrorist organization in this country. And we forget about Jim and Jane Crow, which was supported by white Southern religious leaders. So we need to, have our own come to Jesus meeting, as they say, where we sit down and talk in our own churches, our own synagogues, and we talk across the public sphere about the connection between terrorism across the color line again. White terrorism is terrorism. Terrorism by Muslims is terrorism. Crime by white folks is crime. Crime by black folks is crime. And we need to push that discourse and try to deracialize it. But as we pointed out here, the fact of the matter is that race is the ether and the water that we live in and breathe and that we swim in. And unfortunately for a lot of our white brothers and sisters, white privilege blinds them to these really important facts. So our public elected officials need to step up. They need to act in the public interest and say, yes, we have a problem in the United States with white Christian domestic terrorism, just like we may have a problem with Islamic or other types of religiously motivated terrorism. The second is going to happen. The first will not.
America, it is time to wake up, have these conversations. We cannot move forward if we don't even address it. Chauncey DeVega, chaunceyDeVega.com. Great website. Everybody needs to go there, get informed. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me again.